Hello and welcome to the Drexel Interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohen, speaking to you from the Paul Peck Alumni Center at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today my guest is Barney Frank, who represented the 4th Congressional District in Massachusetts for more than 3 decades. Congressman Frank was a masterful liberal strategist and one of the first openly gay members of Congress. He worked on behalf of a range of issues, among them LGBT rights and affordable housing. He was also a force in financial reform, and with Senator Chris Dodd helped create the 2010 Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. Barney Frank retired from Congress in 2013, but he continues to serve as a political commentator and work for social justice. This is the first of 2 episodes with Barney Frank. In this episode, we'll deal primarily with his personal beliefs, his background, and his life and career. In the second episode, we'll discuss his general views of politics and society as it has evolved over his lifetime and as he sees it developing in the future. Barney Frank, welcome to the Drexel Interview.
Thank you.
Well, I read your book, Frank, which I found absolutely riveting.
Thank you.
And it is a book that seems to me to have many of the qualities that characterize you. It's outspoken and it's pragmatic. And it's gotten mostly rave reviews, but there have been some criticism of it as not being personal enough. And yet my sense is that that book reflects the fact that you are primarily, for all the controversy that surrounded your personal life, primarily a public person. And I wonder if you feel that's true. Not only a public person, but a political person.
Oh, it's very true, and I appreciate you formulating it that way. Actually, there was one very bizarre review in the New York Times. Frank Bruni, himself a gay man, complained that I did not talk about how much sex I was having, my romantic longings, or whether I wanted more sex. I was appalled by that. Some friend pointed out, did he make those demands? He was a gay reviewer. I don't remember him demanding that Leon Panetta or Robert Gates or, in David Axelrod's biography of Obama, he didn't talk about his sex life. But you're right, I do regard the intimate personal details as personal and intimate and of no relevance. What's relevant is the political attitude towards gay people. My decision to come out and what influenced that and the effect of my coming out, those are all public policy questions.
I thought it gave great insight into you in all your dimension for all that criticism of Frank Bruni, and I was struck by that.
Well, I think Mr. Bruni,
well.
The book,
Yeah.
The publisher called it Frank, that was their choice. And I think Mr. Bruni read it too hastily, and I think he thought it was supposed to be 50 Shades of Frank, and read it, therefore, with different expectations.
Yes, but you're not 50 Shades of Frank, you're Frank.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Let's go back to your childhood. You grew up in Bayonne, New Jersey, northern New Jersey, working class suburb of New York City. And you knew from an early age, you were Jewish and you were gay. And you were growing up in this environment where those two things were in their way handicaps. On the other hand, I wonder if growing up in that environment spurred your ambition and was kind of like a goad to what you became.
Well, I should say this. Being Jewish, it was a handicap if I was going to run for office. In 1954, there was still a lot of anti-Semitism in the country. And one encouraging thing about America is that anti-Semitism, which was alive, unfortunately, and flourishing right after World War II, has diminished substantially. And it's not a serious factor anymore for someone's career choices. But of course, being Jewish also was a source of great strength, of the tradition, of what I got it from my family and friends. And I do think, in this sense, I've always been very sensitive to the unfair treatment of people based on some characteristic. And I guess belonging to 2 of the groups that have historically been the victims of that does sort of sharpen your sensitivity to it.
Well, you mentioned your family, and it does seem that you got some sense of social justice from your family. I wonder what your family dinner table was like. Your sister also, later Ann Frank Lewis, became a political person in the Clinton administration.
Right, yeah, she'd been married and divorced, but when she got divorced in the 60s, going back to the name of Anne Frank was really not an option.
I thought of that,
So
actually.
she stayed with Anne Lewis.
But tell me about the family you grew up in, what you talked about.
Intensely political. My parents were not themselves involved in politics directly because politics was pretty seamy and corrupt. You know, people have seen on the waterfront, that was pretty accurate. So you had this trio of corrupt unions, the Teamsters and Longshoremen. I'm a great union guy. Those were racketeers. The mafia and corrupt politicians. So my parents had a great interest. We actually tended to be much more interested in national politics because local politics was kind of off-putting. My parents were great fans of Adlai Stevenson, and we would read the New York Post back when it was a newspaper, and it was a great liberal Bible, and there would be a lot of discussion back and forth about it. Also, my father, he was what we would today call an early adopter. He bought a television set in 1940 when I was born. So we were one of the first people in America to have a TV. And early on, there were some political shows. There was a news, Senator Estes Kefauver from Tennessee investigated the mafia. And fascinating, because at that time, television was so new, people thought that the witnesses in this hearing had a right not to be televised. So they made a compromise with a man named Frank Costello, who was the senior mafia guy, the boss of all the bosses, the capo di tutti capi. And basically the deal was they would show his hands. He had a right not to have his face, but it was fascinating. I was 10 years old. But that got me interested in
But your father had some dealings with the mafia. He owned a truck stop in Jersey City, which was certainly a tough area. And so you say in your book that later some of the things that went on that your father had to deal with helped you out.
Well, it was interesting. What I found at the time was it was interesting. We were Jewish, but there was an interesting kind of alliance between Jews and Italians sort of against the Irish. The Irish were sort of running the show. And my father himself had a brush with the law. He was a very entrepreneurial guy. He was able to make money, dropped out of high school, but he operated in this kind of seamy operation. And he became friendly with some mafia guys. In fact, he did the mafia a favor by giving a job to one of their guys, not a made man, but a close associate, and got him out of jail. And we had a very unpleasant relationship with his partner, who I think was also dishonest. And when he died, some of these mafia guys sort of became our allies in dealing with his partner. So I spent some time with the mafia when I was 20.
Interesting. Maybe taught you certain of your rhetorical skills or your skills
well,
of
certain
negotiation.
rules that I do remember one thing they used to tell me, and that is you can't cheat an honest man, by which they meant that when they had a businessman who they were extorting, they wouldn't go to a purely honest guy and threaten him because he would go to the police. Their method at that time, this is late 50s, early 60s, would be to go to some business guy who was interested in making a little extra money outside the law, and they would get him involved. But then he was trapped and couldn't go to the law when they put the squeeze on him.
Let's talk about your debating skills. You're famous as you call it a counterpuncher, which I love that phrase. You say because you were best in that role because you said, you're lazy, easily distracted on the one hand, you're stimulated by an opposing argument, and you have a sense of humor. It seems to me those pieces make it
I get
up.
bored easily, and so if there's something that I believe in, very often I don't understand why other people don't agree with me, and I mean, it's just so obvious. You're talking about gay rights, well, what do I have to argue that a 19-year-old lesbian should be treated fairly? And so I really come alive when I hear the arguments in opposition. A couple of things that help me. I'm very disciplined in my arguments and my thought. Most people aren't. People get careless. They will use arguments in one context because it makes a certain point, and then a little later they'll use exactly the opposite argument because they just want to say whatever will advance their cause. I have a very good memory. And people will use rhetorical flourishes without fully understanding what they mean. And I have often had this exchange. In other words, what you're saying, that's not what I said. No, excuse me, here's what you said. And people are unhappy when they are confronted with the real meaning of what they've said. Again, you shouldn't use an argument just because it fits a particular point, you can't say, well, this argument is good for this time and place only. And that's basically what I found effective, is you just catch people up in their own mistakes.
Getting back again to an earlier period in your life when you were working on your PhD, that notorious PhD that you did not complete because you didn't want to write your dissertation.
Probably still am.
Maybe you'll finish your dissertation now. You were at Harvard in the 1960s, and you ran a visiting fellows program for the Institute of Politics at John F. Kennedy School at Harvard. And there was a visitor, Robert McNamara, then Defense Secretary, very much unwelcome on college campuses during the Vietnam War at that time. And you were responsible for him. And he was mobbed by irate students, and he had to be rescued. And you write about it, and my sense is that this had a very profound effect on you with respect to extreme activist politics. And I wonder if you would comment on that.
Well, I had been critical of a kind of extreme activist from two grounds. First of all, substantially too far to the left, and also too interested in demonstrations to the exclusion of real political work. And I've always had a free speech gene that says you don't shout down even vicious bigots. So I think I felt that before, but no question that was a kind of a searing personal experience. The other thing, though, is I can't really single it out. This is the period now, 66, this is the beginning of it, when students in particular were doing more and more of this. You had the Columbia situation, others. And it troubled me because I was sure, and I think accurately so, that it was hurting us politically. And this is the beginning of the breach within the Democratic Party between the more liberal, sort of upper socioeconomic echelon intellectuals and working people. Mm-hmm. And the working people were angry at this. They were angry. Look, and it was partly this. These were people who never had the chance to go to college. And they see these young people who had opportunities they never had behaving abusively, disrespectfully. So I really think if you go back, you don't have this split within the Democratic Party much. There were early signs of it, but the 1972 presidential election is the first time you get this split.
That's very interesting. I haven't heard it stated that way before, and it makes a lot of sense.
I remember with all this, and then there was the racial violence, and obviously I substantially agreed with African Americans who thought they were being mistreated. But rioting was a stupid way, although an emotionally driven way, I suppose, to deal with it. And I remember this being confirmed to me in 1969 in New York City. New York City is this great liberal bastion. And there are primaries for mayor. And John Lindsay, the liberal mayor, loses the Republican primary to a conservative. And Robert Wagner, a former liberal Democratic mayor, loses the Democratic Party primary to a conservative. The fact that conservatives won both primaries was just a sign of how normal liberal voters had been alienated. Ironically, that sort of worked to Lindsay's favor because he now had two conservatives running against each other. He won as a third party, but with a minority of the vote. And the fears I had that they were driving away many people who would ordinarily be liberal voters, it was vindicated in that 69 primary.
Let's get to the two issues at least, that have been central to your career. First, gay rights. And tell us about your decision, I guess it was in the late 1980s, 87, 88?
87.
To become,
I was the first voluntarily here. My colleague Gary Stutz, well, here's the deal. A number of gay men had been caught in compromising situations in which it was clear that they were gay. And they all said, oh no, I'm not gay. I was just so drunk, I don't remember what I was doing. Well, in my experience, if you're too drunk to remember what you were doing, you probably weren't doing anything. And these were gay men who wouldn't admit they were gay. Then came my colleague Gary Stutz, who had a sexual affair with a house page. The page was old enough, so it wasn't a legal issue, but it was an inappropriate relationship between a sort of supervisor and one of the young people under us. And he was confronted with it, and for the first time said, yes, I am gay. Now, it wasn't a voluntary coming out, but it was the first person to acknowledge it. A couple years later, because we waited until his situation cleared up, I was the first to volunteer that I was gay. I was the first one to tell the Boston Globe, if you ask me, I'll tell you. Because the press had this interesting view that they would not ask you because that was an invasion of privacy. They were dying to know. And I actually had a little dance with the Boston Globe. I said, I'm ready to come out. They said, good, have a press conference. I said, no, I'm not going to have a press conference because at that point, I didn't know how people were going to react. I'm going to want to argue that it's not a big deal that I'm gay. And if I have a press conference, people are going to say, it's not a big deal. Why'd you make a press conference out of it? So I said to them, you have to ask me. They said, oh, no, we have a rule that we don't ask people. I said, well, I'm telling you to ask me. They were afraid that some other newspaper would scoop them on it because I was not the most discreet person in my discussion of this. So finally, in the end of May of 1987, they sent a lesbian reporter down who I'd known to ask me if I was gay, and I said yes.
I just have to give the quote that there are many wonderful lines in your book, but the one that perhaps I like best is Tip O'Neill's telling Chris Matthews, his then press secretary, that Barney Frank was coming out of the room.
Out of the room, yeah.
Coming out of the room.
And Tip was a very...
You liked him, didn't you?
Absolutely. And, he was a master of the old school, but he wasn't any gay. He understood this. It was perplexing to him. But as I said, he tried hard to keep up, and he generally got the music right. He didn't always get the words.
That's right. It's part and parcel, though, of your ability to get along. Even people who in some ways might have antithetical views or perspectives on life than you. And has that always been the case? Do you pride yourself on an ability, it's also connected to your ability to work out legislation that involves compromise. That has been your reputation.
I agree, because you start, I want to be very clear, compromise is very important as long as you start from a position of principle. Compromise isn't an end in itself. The middle is not some virtuous place. You start from a set of values. But I've also said, people have said to me, well, you're a pragmatist, I'm an idealist, I'm different. My answer to them is, the more you care about your ideals, it seems to me the more obligated you are to be pragmatic. Because if you have ideals and you never do anything to implement them, that makes you feel good. It doesn't help anybody. It doesn't feed a kid or clean up a river or provide housing. And I've always felt that. And it did start out, I think growing up in Bayonne, I was living in a Jewish middle-class household. I went to a large public high school with a wide range of people, not a lot of African Americans, very few in Bayonne at the time, but a wide range of people from different economic and ethnic backgrounds, and I worked at my father's truck stop. And so I was exposed to people of all kinds. And, I used to like to try to figure out, what motivated people.
How to get along with
that would be helpful, yeah.
Let's talk about your sister, Ann Lewis, who was so involved with the Clinton administration and was the senior advisor to Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. Was there any tension at any point? Has there been between you and your sister?
Almost none. There was one time in 1996 when Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act. I didn't blame him for that. He had to do it. Bob Dole engineered it. But I did get a phone call one day saying that and I was defending it, having signed it. The late Senator Paul Wellstone, a great liberal, voted for the Defense of Marriage Act. In that climate, it was very difficult. I didn't want somebody who was supportive on every other area of gay rights to sacrifice his political career because of this. But they ran an ad that sort of boasted about signing it, and that was a problem. And I called Ann, and she took it off. But we didn't, she hadn't been the one who did it. No, we haven't agreed 100% on everything, but we've been very mutually supportive.
This is an example of a quality that you have that I'm sure made you a lot of friends, or at least the fact that you would understand that someone might not take a position that you felt strongly about because it would hurt their political career.
No, I agree. And the question is, if it's someone who's generally your friend, you do it. And that's a very good point. I hadn't thought about it in exactly these terms. But let me respond because you've triggered this for me. Too often, people judge other people much more harshly than they would judge themselves. That is, everybody I know in elected office at some point makes a decision, that's a bridge too far, I'm going to get in too much trouble. But they don't apply that to other people. They kind of give themselves a pass that they won't give anybody else. And I always thought that was a great mistake. The other issue is when you're talking about candidates, one line that I have been very effective, I tell people, look, I'm asking you to vote for so-and-so, and I know he's not perfect. But the only time I ever voted for a perfect candidate was I voted for myself the first time I ran. And The other thing is, I borrowed from Henny Youngman, the great comedian from the 50s and 60s. The decision you make in public life, whether it's for a candidate, for whether or not you're going to stay with this bill or not, the theory is compared to what? He had one of his great one-liners, two-liner, how's your wife? Compared to what? Really very clever. You rarely judge in the abstract. And it is certainly the case in public policy. You don't have the luxury of creating what you want out of fresh clay. You do the best you can, and then you have to think, okay, what would the alternative be?
So let's talk briefly about the scandal that you went through in the late 1980s, where you resulted in a congressional reprimand, I believe, because of a man with whom you had a relationship who used your apartment in Washington for assignations without your...
No, that's not true.
That's not true?
He alleged that. The ethics committee found that was
that was not true. So the whole incident, it would embarrassed you, but the incident, do you think it would have become an incident had you not been gay?
Yeah, I think a straight man who was involved with a prostitute would have had the same problem, although it wouldn't have been fatal. There's Senator David Vitter from Louisiana was elected senator after it came out that he'd been engaged with a prostitute. And what happened was I found an ad and I hired him for sex. And that was part of my being closeted. And that whole period is when I realized I had to come out. That trying to live as a gay man publicly, a public figure, privately closeted, wasn't working. I was driven by needs that would make me do stupid things. He was very smart. He figured out, at least clever in this sense. He saw the kind of emotional needs I had and took advantage of it. I blame me only. This is not a cop-out. I was the one who was irresponsible. Here's what happened. I was paying him after it was no longer sexual. I was using him as an aide, and he started to behave irresponsibly. I later found out he'd gone back on some kind of substance. So I said, look, this is over. And he was very angry and stewed about what to do. Now, in the normal situation, what the person does there is to out the other person. That happened to Lord Brown, who'd been the head of BP. He had a similar kind of engagement. And when he broke off with the guy because he wouldn't give in to extortion, the guy outed him. Well, he couldn't out me because I'd outed myself. I mean, literally, when I broke off with him, as I came out and said, this is not the way I want to be. So he then had to invent other things beyond my simply being gay, most of which were untrue, and the ethics committee did say I behaved irresponsibly, but they did at least exonerate me from the others.
I listen to you talk, and I think how straightforward you are, and why are not more politicians? I mean, it's served you very well, hasn't it? And yet we don't see that. We see this airbrushed sort of talk. Why don't people use it as a strategy, if nothing else?
You asked me before whether my being gay and Jewish somehow goaded me. It actually armed me. Here's the deal. I first got elected to the state legislature in 1972 from a district that was very unlike the rest of Boston. Downtown, the Back Bay and Beacon Hill, kind of like Center City here in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. It was a unique district, and at the time, 1972, I said, you know what, this is the only district I could get elected in. There was a lot of highly educated people who were mobile, single people, some closeted gays. And so I go to the legislature, and I suddenly realized I was pretty good at my job, so I didn't think I could lose, but I also knew I couldn't win anything else. Most politicians, you get into the state legislature, unless you're the president or you're 80, you're thinking of the next job. And when you're thinking of the next job, it kind of inhibits you. People somehow get the view that you're more likely to alienate people than win them over. And I said, say in the book, I had the freedom of nothing left to lose. I mean, I could stay where I was. So I was freed of these political constraints. And ironically, as you suggested, it turned out that was better politics than being worried.
Now, you were a congressman under 5 presidents, is that correct?
Well, as we say, alongside 5 presidents.
Of the 5?
Yeah, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Obama.
Okay. Which of that group did you admire most? Which man did you admire most?
Bill Clinton. Obama's very good. I'm a big fan of his. I think Clinton was a better politician, both very smart, both very committed. I think Clinton was a better politician.
So looking back at your career, we're almost out of time. I want to ask you, is there anything you regret not having done that you wished you had a little more time to do?
I wish I'd have come out earlier. If I'd stayed, there were two areas that I worked on. One was to further promote rental housing for poor people instead of putting them into mortgages that they couldn't sustain. But we actually, after I left, something that I had started on, setting up a low-income trust fund, went through. The other great frustration was I believe that the key to improving the quality of life at home, diminishing inequality, even fighting bad conditions abroad, is a substantial reduction in our bloated military budget and an end to these interventions. And I was never as successful as I wanted to be there. And the one issue I wish I was still there for would be to say to the president, look, your instincts about pulling out of Afghanistan and Iraq are right. Don't be pressured into reversing that.
Well, we're out of time, and I want to thank you so much, Barney Frank, for being here today.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel Interview.